I uploaded a family Christmas pic and a stranger commented, "Why is my husband in your living room?" I stared at my phone screen, rereading the comment for the fifth time in 30 seconds. The notification had come through while I was making coffee. Just a casual scroll through Instagram to see who'd liked our Christmas morning photo. 43 likes, 12 comments, all the usual responses from friends and family. Cute pajamas, love the tree, Merry Christmas. And then this one from someone named Vanessa Ippolito, an account I'd never seen before. A woman whose profile picture showed someone around my age with dark hair and sharp eyes. Her comment sat there like a bomb waiting to detonate. "Why is my husband in your living room?" My hand started shaking enough that I had to set my mug down on the counter before I spilled it everywhere. The photo itself was innocent, or so I'd thought. Our whole family gathered in front of our Christmas tree at 7 this morning. Me and my husband Derek, our two kids Sloan and Evan, Derek's brother Garrett who'd driven up from Austin to spend the holiday with us, and my parents who'd stayed over Christmas Eve. Everyone in matching red pajamas that my mom had insisted on buying. Everyone smiling at the camera I'd set on the tripod with the timer. A perfectly normal family Christmas moment that I'd posted without a second thought, adding some holly emojis and a caption about feeling grateful. Standard holiday social media content that hundreds of my friends and acquaintances had seen by now. Except apparently one of those people looking at the photo saw something very different than I did. I zoomed in on the image, studying each face carefully like I was examining evidence. Sloan and Evan looked exactly like themselves. My 9-year-old daughter with her gap-toothed grin, and my 6-year-old son with his bedhead that no amount of brushing ever fixed. My parents stood on the left side looking tired but happy, my dad's arm around my mom's shoulders. I was in the center wearing the red pajama set with white snowflakes, my blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, dark circles under my eyes from staying up too late assembling Evan's train set. Derek stood next to me with his hand on my shoulder, wearing the matching pajamas, his brown hair slightly graying at the temples at 34. And Garrett stood on the far right, taller than Derek by a few inches, broader in the shoulders, with the same brown hair but no gray yet, smiling his easy smile that made everyone comfortable. I clicked on Vanessa Ippolito's profile and my stomach dropped further. Her account was private, so I could only see her profile picture and bio. Lives in Austin, Texas. Married. Mother of 2. The Austin detail made my hands go cold because that's where Garrett lived. That's where he'd driven from yesterday to spend Christmas with us here in Denver. I'd known Garrett for 12 years, ever since Derek and I started dating in college. He'd been Derek's best man at our wedding. He was Uncle Garrett to my kids, the fun uncle who brought extravagant gifts and told jokes that made them giggle until they couldn't breathe. He'd never mentioned a wife, never mentioned being married at all. Derek had told me years ago that Garrett preferred being single, that he dated casually but never wanted to settle down, that he liked his independence too much. I screenshot the comment before it could disappear and walked into the living room, where wrapping paper still littered the floor from the morning's present opening. Derek was helping Evan set up his new race car track while Sloan played with her craft kit at the coffee table. My parents had gone to their hotel to rest before coming back for Christmas dinner. Garrett had gone out to grab something from his car, or so he'd said 20 minutes ago. I sat down on the couch and tried to keep my voice steady when I called Derek's name. He looked up from the racetrack with that easy smile that had attracted me to him in the first place, that openness that made him seem incapable of deception. I turned my phone toward him and asked if he knew anyone named Vanessa Ippolito. His face didn't change at all, showing zero recognition. He said the name didn't ring a bell and asked why. I showed him the comment. Derek's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked like concern. He took my phone and read the comment 3 times, his brow furrowing deeper with each pass. He zoomed in on the photo just like I had, studying each face. Then he said this had to be a mistake or a weird joke, that obviously Garrett wasn't married to some random woman on Instagram, but his voice had an uncertainty in it that made my skin prickle. He called Garrett's name toward the front door, his tone sharp enough that Sloan looked up from her craft project with worried eyes. When Garrett didn't answer, Derek stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the driveway. Garrett's truck was gone. Derek pulled out his own phone and called his brother's number. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I opened Instagram again and looked at the comment, which now had 3 likes from other accounts I didn't recognize. Someone named Patricia Morrow had replied to Vanessa's comment saying, "Oh my God, call me right now." Another account called Rachel Sung had replied with just a string of shocked face emojis. I felt like I was watching my peaceful Christmas morning disintegrate in real time, while my children played innocently just feet away, completely unaware that something fundamental had just fractured. Derek tried calling Garrett 2 more times with the same result. Then he sent a text that I could see over his shoulder. "Where did you go? We need to talk. Now." The message showed as delivered but not read. Minutes crawled by with no response. I went back to Vanessa Ippolito's profile and sent her a direct message, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. "Hi, I saw your comment on my Christmas photo. I think there might be some confusion. The man on the right side of the photo is my brother-in-law Garrett. He's not married as far as I know. Can you please explain your comment?" I hit send and watched the message sit there in that weird limbo of being delivered to someone who hadn't accepted my message request yet. Derek sat back down next to me heavily, like his legs had stopped working properly. He said Garrett had been acting a little strange this visit, more distracted than usual, checking his phone constantly. I'd noticed it too, but attributed it to work stress. Garrett ran some kind of consulting business that he was always vague about when asked for details. My phone buzzed with a response faster than I'd expected. Vanessa had accepted my message request and replied, "That man is my husband. His name is Michael Garrett Townsend. We've been married for 8 years. We have 2 daughters, Lily, who is 7, and Sophie, who is 5. He told me he was going to a work conference in Chicago this week. So I'll ask you again, why is my husband in your living room wearing matching Christmas pajamas with your family?" The message felt like a physical blow. I read it out loud to Derek and watched his face go pale. He grabbed my phone and read it himself, then read it again, his jaw working like he was trying to process information that didn't fit into any framework he understood. Michael Garrett Townsend. Garrett's full name was Garrett Michael Townsend. He'd always gone by Garrett, always introduced himself that way. But Michael Garrett would be close enough that someone might use either name. Derek said this was impossible, that he'd known his brother his entire life, that there was no way Garrett had been married for 8 years without Derek knowing. But even as he said it, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. When was the last time Derek had actually visited Garrett in Austin? I asked. Derek's silence was answer enough. It had been years. Garrett always came to Denver to visit us, always had some excuse for why we couldn't come to Austin. The house was being renovated. He was moving apartments. Work was too crazy to host visitors. Always something. And we'd accepted those excuses because Garrett was generous with his time when he came here, spending days with the kids, taking us all out to nice dinners, being the perfect uncle and brother. It never occurred to any of us to question why the visits only went one direction. I typed another message to Vanessa, my hands shaking so badly I had to retype several words. "Can you send me a photo of your husband? I need to be absolutely certain we're talking about the same person." The response came within seconds. A photo loaded on my screen showing a man who was undeniably Garrett, standing in front of a Christmas tree with 2 little girls who had his same brown hair and smile. He wore a green sweater and looked relaxed and happy, his arms around both girls. The timestamp on the photo said it was taken last Christmas, exactly 1 year ago, which meant last Christmas when Garrett had come to Denver and spent 3 days with us, he'd left a wife and 2 daughters back in Austin. I showed the photo to Derek and his face crumpled in a way I'd never seen before, like his entire understanding of reality had just been invalidated. Derek stood up and started pacing, running his hands through his hair over and over. He said he needed to call his parents, that they needed to know about this, but I grabbed his arm and told him to wait. We needed more information before we blew up his whole family's Christmas. We needed to understand what was happening. But even as I said it, I knew what was happening. Garrett had been living a double life. He'd maintained a family in Austin that none of us knew about while playing the role of carefree bachelor uncle whenever he visited Denver. The calculation required to pull that off for 8 years made me feel sick. How many lies had he told? How many stories had he fabricated? How many times had he sat at our dinner table talking about his life while editing out an entire wife and 2 children? Vanessa sent another message. "I'm looking at your Instagram now. That other man in the photo, the one who looks similar to Michael, is that his brother, Derek Townsend?" I confirmed that yes, Derek was Garrett's brother and my husband. The response came quickly. Michael told me his brother died in a car accident 10 years ago. He said his whole family was killed. Parents, brother, everyone. He said he was the only survivor. I read that message out loud to Derek and he made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. He sat down heavily on the couch and put his head in his hands. Our kids were still playing, completely absorbed in their new toys, unaware that their uncle had apparently erased their entire existence from his other life. Derek's parents were alive and well at their hotel down the street, planning to come back for turkey dinner in a few hours. None of us were dead. But to Garrett's wife, to his other family, we were all ghosts. I asked Vanessa why she was on Instagram on Christmas morning looking at random photos, how she'd even found our picture. She explained that she'd been suspicious for weeks because Michael had been acting strange, more secretive with his phone, taking calls in other rooms, working late more often. When he'd left for his supposed Chicago work conference yesterday, something felt wrong. She'd never questioned his work trips before, but this time she'd decided to check. She'd looked through his laptop while he was sleeping the night before and found my Instagram account saved in his bookmarks. She'd been monitoring my account since then, waiting to see if I posted anything. When the Christmas photo went up this morning, she saw her husband clear as day. She said she'd already called a lawyer before even commenting on my photo. She'd packed bags for herself and the girls. She was done. Derek tried calling Garrett again with the same result. Straight to voicemail. I suggested maybe Garrett had seen Vanessa's comment and panicked. Maybe he was driving somewhere trying to figure out what to do. Derek said he was going to call his parents after all, that they deserved to know immediately. I didn't try to stop him this time. He dialed his father's number and I heard the phone ring twice before his dad Robert answered with a cheerful Merry Christmas. Derek's voice was flat when he told his father they needed to come back to the house right away, that something had happened with Garrett. Robert's tone shifted immediately to concern, asking if Garrett was hurt. if there'd been an accident. Derek said no accident, just come now, and hung up before his father could ask more questions. While we waited for Derek's parents to arrive, I went through every photo I had of Garrett on my phone, every family gathering and holiday visit, looking at them with new eyes. Garrett holding baby Sloan in the hospital. Garrett teaching Evan to ride a bike last summer. Garrett carving the turkey at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. In every photo, he looked genuine, present, engaged. There was no hint of deception in his smile, no shadow of the separate life he was maintaining in Austin. I'd always thought Garrett was such a natural with kids, so patient and playful. Now I understood why. He had practice with his own daughters that we never knew about. Every skill he'd demonstrated with our children, he'd learned first with Lily and Sophie. Robert and Patricia arrived 15 minutes later, coming through the front door with confused expressions. Patricia was carrying a tin of cookies she'd baked that morning, still wearing her Christmas sweater with a reindeer on it. Robert asked what was so urgent it couldn't wait until dinner. Derek held up his phone showing Vanessa's comment and the subsequent messages. He explained everything in a flat, emotionless voice while his parents stood in our entryway looking increasingly distressed. Patricia's face went white when Derek showed her the photo of Garrett with the 2 little girls. She sat down on the nearest chair like her legs had given out. Robert kept shaking his head, saying this couldn't be right. There had to be some explanation. But his voice lacked conviction. Patricia asked in a small voice if this meant she had 2 granddaughters she'd never met, girls who were 7 and 5, who'd been alive all this time while Garrett came to Denver acting like he had no family obligations. The math was devastating. Lily had been born a year before Sloan, which meant Garrett had become a father for the first time and never told anyone. He'd had a second daughter when Evan was 3, and we'd had no idea. Patricia started crying quietly, and Robert put his arm around her shoulders. He asked if we'd heard from Garrett, if we knew where he'd gone. Derek said Garrett's truck was missing from the driveway and he wasn't answering his phone. Robert tried calling his younger son himself with the same result. We were all calling a number that rang into a void. I suggested we might be able to find Garrett's actual address in Austin through property records or online searches. Derek pulled out his laptop and started searching while his parents sat on the couch looking shell-shocked. I went back to messaging with Vanessa, asking if she could give us her address, explaining that Derek's parents wanted to somehow make this right, even though we had no idea how that was possible. Vanessa sent her address immediately, along with a note saying she'd appreciate if we gave her a few days before showing up, that she needed time to process everything with her daughters. I promised we would respect that, and asked if she would be willing to talk on the phone later. She said maybe, that she needed to think about it. She sent one more message. Did he ever talk about us? Did he ever slip up and mention having kids? I thought back through 12 years of conversations with Garrett, every visit and phone call, searching my memory for any hint that he'd been living a double life. And the terrible truth was, there had been nothing. He'd never slipped, never mentioned a wife or children, never showed us photos or told stories that would reveal his secret. The only thing that stood out now in retrospect was how little Garrett actually shared about his daily life in Austin. When we asked about his work, he kept answers vague. When we asked about dating, he deflected with jokes. When we invited him to bring friends or girlfriends to visit, he always came alone. We'd thought he was private, maybe a little lonely, definitely committed to his bachelor lifestyle. We'd felt sorry for him sometimes. This man approaching 40 without a partner or family. The irony was crushing. I told Vanessa that no, he'd never mentioned her or the girls, that he'd been completely convincing in his portrayal of a single man. She sent back a message that just said, 8 years. 8 years of elaborate deception. 8 years of maintaining 2 completely separate identities. 8 years of lies so comprehensive that nobody in either family had suspected anything was wrong. The level of organization required was staggering. He would have needed 2 sets of everything. 2 phones probably, though we'd only ever seen one. Separate social media accounts or none at all on the Denver side. Careful management of his schedule to make sure his Austin family never overlapped with his Denver visits. Stories and excuses ready for both sides. It was exhausting just thinking about the logistics. Derek found property records showing that Michael and Vanessa Townsend owned a house on Maple Creek Drive in Austin, purchased 7 years ago. He pulled up Google Street View, and we all stared at the screen showing a nice 2-story house with a swing set visible in the backyard. Garrett's truck was in the driveway in the Street View image, confirming this was really his address. Patricia made a sound like a wounded animal when she saw the swing set. Those were her granddaughters who played on that equipment, children she'd never held or read stories to or baked cookies for. Robert's face had gone from shocked to angry. He said he wanted to drive to Austin right now and demand answers from Garrett face to face. Derek pointed out that Austin was an 18-hour drive and Garrett probably wasn't even there anyway since his truck had been in our driveway 20 minutes ago. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown Austin number. I answered it cautiously and heard a woman's voice I didn't recognize ask if this was Caitlin Townsend. I confirmed and she introduced herself as Leslie Kaufman, Vanessa's sister. She said Vanessa had asked her to call because Vanessa was too upset to talk anymore right now. Leslie's voice was controlled but tight with anger. She said she'd been suspicious of Michael for years, that something about him always felt off, that he traveled too much and was too secretive. She'd told Vanessa multiple times that she thought he was hiding something, but Vanessa had trusted her husband. Leslie asked if our family had any idea what Michael did for work, because Vanessa didn't really know beyond vague mentions of consulting. That question stopped me cold because I realized I had no idea what Garrett actually did for work either. He'd always said consulting, always implied it was boring technical stuff not worth explaining. Derek admitted the same thing, that Garrett had been deliberately vague about his career for years, and Derek had never pushed for details. Leslie said that was interesting because Vanessa had the same experience, that Michael claimed he couldn't talk much about his work due to confidentiality agreements. Now it seemed obvious that the vagueness was intentional, a way to avoid giving specific details that might be verified or questioned. If neither family knew what he really did, neither could accidentally expose his lies by asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. Leslie said she'd helped Vanessa start going through Michael's home office that morning after Vanessa saw the Christmas photo. They'd found multiple cell phones in a locked drawer, along with 2 different laptops and several external hard drives. One of the phones had been buzzing constantly with notifications from a number Vanessa didn't recognize. Leslie described what they'd found in the office, and it painted a picture of someone who'd been meticulously maintaining separate digital lives. She asked if we wanted her to check what was on some of these devices, if we wanted to know the full scope of what Michael had been hiding. Derek said yes immediately. He wanted to know everything, wanted to understand how his brother had pulled this off and why. Robert stood up and announced he was going to file a missing person report on Garrett, that they needed to find him and get answers. I pointed out that Garrett wasn't really missing. He'd just left our house a couple hours ago, probably because he'd seen Vanessa's comment and panicked. But Robert insisted that they needed police involvement, that this situation was too serious to just wait around. Patricia agreed, saying she wanted officers looking for Garrett, wanted him found and brought back to explain himself. Derek called the non-emergency police line and tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher, but it became clear quickly that there was no crime to report. Garrett was an adult who'd left our house of his own volition. The fact that he'd been lying to his family for years wasn't actually illegal. The dispatcher suggested family counseling and ended the call. Leslie called back an hour later with an update that made everything exponentially worse. She said they'd managed to get into one of the laptops using a password they'd found written in a notebook in Michael's desk. What they'd found was evidence that Michael Garrett Townsend had at least 3 other identities that they could confirm so far. Different names, different locations, possibly different families, though they were still piecing that together. Leslie's voice shook as she read off the names. Garrett Thompson in Seattle, Michael Townsend in Austin, which we knew about, Garrett Michael in Denver, which was us, and a 4th identity, Thomas Garrett, with an address in Phoenix. Each identity had its own email accounts, social media profiles, and financial records. The scope of the deception was so massive that my brain couldn't process it. Derek made a sound like he couldn't breathe, and I put my hand on his back, feeling him shaking. His parents sat frozen on the couch, Patricia crying openly now, Robert's face completely blank with shock. Leslie continued explaining what they'd found. Bank accounts in all 4 names with significant balances, multiple credit cards, P.O. boxes in different cities, a spreadsheet that appeared to track his various identities and which stories he'd told to which family. The spreadsheet had columns for names, locations, occupations he'd claimed, family stories he'd invented, and notes about topics to avoid with each group. It was a masterclass in organized deception. There was a column labeled DEN for Denver with notes like Brother Derek, Niece Sloan, Nephew Evan, Parents Robert and Patricia, Claims bachelor lifestyle, Visits for holidays, Work kept vague, Consulting, no dating questions. Another column labeled a US for Austin had notes about Vanessa and the girls, his supposed job in medical device sales, his story about his family being dead. A column for SCA mentioned a woman named Jennifer and 2 sons, plus a dog named Bailey. Phoenix had a column for PHX with a woman named Diana, but the family notes section was less detailed, possibly meaning that identity was newer. Leslie said they'd found plane tickets and rental car receipts going back years, showing a pattern of travel between all 4 cities on a rotation that must have required incredible planning. When he was supposedly on work trips from Austin, he was actually in Denver or Seattle or Phoenix. When he left Denver claiming to go back to Austin, he might have been going anywhere. The whole structure was dizzying in its complexity. I asked Leslie if she'd contacted the police in Austin about this, because it seemed like identity fraud at minimum had to be illegal. Probably financial crimes too if he was using fake names to open bank accounts. Leslie said Vanessa had called a lawyer who was advising them to gather all the evidence first before involving police, that they needed to understand the full scope before making reports. The lawyer had also pointed out something disturbing. If Michael had been maintaining these separate identities for years, filing taxes under multiple names, working under different identities, then he'd been committing serious federal crimes, the kind that came with prison time, which meant if they reported him, he might run rather than face the consequences. Leslie said the lawyer was recommending they move carefully and document everything first. Derek started searching social media for the names Leslie had given us. He found a Facebook account for Garrett Thompson in Seattle showing a man who was definitely his brother, posting photos with a woman named Jennifer and two boys who looked around 10 and 8. The post went back 5 years and showed a completely normal family life. Birthday parties, school events, hiking trips. Jennifer Thompson's account was public and showed the same photos plus many more. She'd tagged Garrett Thompson in dozens of posts over the years. Derek found an Instagram account for Thomas Garrett in Phoenix that was more recent, only about 2 years of posts, showing Garrett with a younger woman named Diana, who appeared to be in her late 20s. No kids visible in those photos, but several posts mentioned date nights and weekend getaways. Patricia was looking over Derek's shoulder at the photos, and she made this sound like she was being strangled. She kept saying, "Those are my grandsons," while looking at the Seattle photos, pointing at the two boys who had the Townsend family nose and smile. Robert had his phone out and was trying to call Garrett again, over and over, getting voicemail every time. He left a message saying that they knew everything. They'd found all the other families, and Garrett needed to come home right now and explain himself. His voice broke on the last few words. I realized Sloan and Evan had stopped playing with their toys and were watching us with worried faces. Evan asked why Grandpa was crying and why everyone looked sad on Christmas. I took the kids upstairs to Sloan's room and tried to explain in terms they could understand that the adults had found out some confusing information about Uncle Garrett and needed to figure some things out. Sloan asked if Uncle Garrett was in trouble, and I said yes, probably, but it was grown-up trouble and nothing for them to worry about. Evan asked if Uncle Garrett was still going to stay for Christmas dinner, and I realized I had no idea how to answer that. I told them we'd figure it out and suggested they play up here for a while. Sloan gave me a look that suggested she understood more than I was saying, but she took her brother's hand and they went to play with her new dollhouse. I went back downstairs where Derek had his laptop open to a website about bigamy and identity fraud. Bigamy, I learned, was still illegal in all 50 states, though rarely prosecuted. But what Garrett had done went beyond simple bigamy. He'd created entirely false identities, used those identities to open financial accounts, possibly filed fraudulent tax returns, and deceived multiple families for years. The federal charges alone could add up to decades in prison. Derek was reading about wire fraud and identity theft statutes, his face getting paler with each paragraph. Robert asked what they were supposed to do now, how they were supposed to handle knowing that his son was a criminal who'd built his entire adult life on lies. Patricia said they needed to contact the other families, Seattle and Phoenix, and warn them the same way Vanessa had warned us. They deserved to know the truth, too. Derek found Jennifer Thompson's phone number through a reverse lookup service and called it before anyone could talk him out of it. I heard it ring twice before a woman answered saying hello in a cheerful voice that suggested her Christmas was going much better than ours. Derek introduced himself as Garrett Thompson's brother, and there was a long pause before Jennifer said that Garrett didn't have a brother, that his family had died years ago. Derek said that was a lie, that he and his parents were very much alive in Denver, that Garrett had spent Christmas morning with them before disappearing. Jennifer's voice went cold and sharp. She said this wasn't funny, and whoever was making prank calls on Christmas needed to find a better hobby. Derek said it wasn't a prank, and asked if she could send him a photo of her husband. There was another long pause filled with tension before Jennifer asked why she should do that. Derek explained everything in a rush. The Christmas photo, Vanessa's comment, what they'd found about the multiple identities. Jennifer was silent for so long that Derek thought she'd hung up. Then she said to hold on, and the line went quiet except for background noise. A minute later, Derek's phone buzzed with an incoming photo message. It showed Garrett, no question about it, wearing a Seahawks jersey and grilling burgers in a backyard. Jennifer came back on the line, and her voice was shaking when she asked Derek to send her a photo proving he was real, that this wasn't some elaborate scam. Derek sent her our Christmas photo, and we all waited in silence for her response. When she called back 3 minutes later, she was crying so hard she could barely speak. She managed to say that Garrett was supposed to be at a training conference in Portland and would be back tomorrow. She said they'd been married for 6 years and had 2 sons together. She said she was going to be sick. I took the phone from Derek because he looked like he might collapse. I introduced myself to Jennifer as Derek's wife and tried to speak in a calm, steady voice even though my insides were churning. I told her about Vanessa in Austin and Diana in Phoenix, about the evidence Leslie had found showing the scope of Garrett's deception. Jennifer kept making these small, gasping sounds like she couldn't get enough air. She said she'd noticed Garrett being secretive with his phone lately, noticed him taking calls in his car, noticed him being vague about his work travel schedule. She'd asked him a few months ago if he was having an affair, and he'd been so convincing in his denials, so hurt that she'd even suggested it, that she'd felt guilty for bringing it up. Now she realized he'd been having much more than an affair. He'd been having entire other lives. Jennifer said she was putting me on speaker so her sister who'd come over for Christmas could hear this too. Another woman's voice came on the line asking for clarification about what exactly was happening. I explained again as clearly as I could manage while my own thoughts felt like they were fragmenting. This other woman, Jennifer's sister, whose name I learned was Rebecca, started asking practical questions. Had anyone contacted law enforcement? Had anyone checked financial records to see if Garrett had been stealing money from these women? Did anyone know Garrett's real legal name, the one on his original birth certificate? That last question stumped all of us. Robert said his son's legal name was Garrett Michael Townsend, that he had the birth certificate in a safe at home. But maybe that wasn't even true. Maybe everything was fake. Rebecca, who apparently worked as a paralegal, said we needed to get ahead of this situation fast. If Garrett realized all his identities had been exposed, he might try to disappear completely or access bank accounts and drain them before anyone could freeze the assets. She recommended that all the women start documenting everything immediately, taking screenshots of accounts and social media, gathering any financial documents they had access to, and contacting lawyers before the end of the day if possible. Even though it was Christmas, emergency legal consultations were available. Patricia asked how they were supposed to afford lawyers, and Rebecca said Vanessa and Jennifer would likely qualify for victim services, that there were resources for women who'd been defrauded by spouses. The word victim hung in the air like smoke. Leslie called my phone back while Derek was still talking to Jennifer and Rebecca. She said they'd gotten into another one of the laptops and found something that changed the timeline of everything. According to documents they'd discovered, Garrett had been using the Michael Garrett identity in Austin before he'd moved to Denver and met Derek in college, which meant Derek hadn't known his brother's original life, had only known one of the personas. Leslie said it appeared Garrett's real identity, his original legal identity, was actually Michael Townsend from Austin. Garrett Michael had been the fake name, the identity he'd created to attend college in Denver and eventually build a life there. Everything Derek and his parents had believed about Garrett's past was inverted. He hadn't maintained a secret life in Austin separate from his Denver family. He'd maintained a secret Denver family separate from his original Austin life. Derek's face went through a transformation I'd never seen before. He looked like someone had reached into his chest and ripped something essential out. His parents had similar reactions. Patricia doubling over like she'd been physically struck. Robert standing up and then sitting back down like he'd forgotten how his body worked. Their entire relationship with Garrett had been built on lies from the very beginning. He'd entered their lives in college under a false identity, cultivated relationships with them using a fake history, and maintained those relationships for over a decade while keeping his real life completely separate. They weren't the original family that he'd betrayed by creating a secret second family. They were the second family, maybe not even the second, who knew how many others there might be. Leslie said she'd found enrollment documents showing that Michael Townsend had legally changed his name to Garrett Thompson when he'd moved to Seattle around the same time he'd started college in Denver. So Garrett Thompson was actually his legal name during those years, which made the Denver identity of Garrett Michael a derivative of his Seattle identity. The complexity of the timeline made my head hurt. She'd also found evidence that he'd changed his name back to Michael Townsend a few years after college, possibly around the time he'd married Vanessa, which would make that his current legal identity, meaning everything he'd done in Denver under the name Garrett Michael Townsend had been using a former legal name that was no longer valid. The layers of deception went so deep I couldn't track them all. Robert stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our snow-covered street with his back to all of us. His shoulders were shaking and I realized he was crying silently. Patricia reached for Derek's hand, and he let her take it, the two of them sitting there looking destroyed. I thought about what this meant for my kids, for Sloan and Evan upstairs playing with their Christmas presents. The uncle they'd loved and trusted their entire lives had never been real. Every memory they had with him was tainted now. Every birthday and holiday visit had been built on lies. How was I supposed to explain that to them? How was I supposed to help them process that the person they'd thought they knew had never actually existed? Jennifer was still on Derek's phone, and I could hear her talking to Rebecca in the background, their voices tight with stress. Jennifer came back on the line and asked if anyone had checked whether Garrett had life insurance policies or property in any of these different names. Patricia said she'd helped Garrett fill out paperwork years ago for what he'd called a small life insurance policy through his work, with Derek listed as the beneficiary. Jennifer said she was the beneficiary on a much larger policy that Garrett had taken out 3 years ago. The implications were disturbing. If something happened to Garrett under his various identities, multiple families might try to claim insurance benefits or property. The legal nightmare would be extraordinary. Rebecca said they needed to contact all insurance companies and banks immediately to put alerts on all accounts associated with all the names. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from another Austin number. I answered and heard Vanessa's voice for the first time, hoarse like she'd been crying for hours. She asked if we'd found Garrett yet, and I said no, he was still missing. Vanessa said she'd been going through old photos and realized something that made the situation even more disturbing. In photos from their wedding 8 years ago, several of the groomsmen were people she'd never met before that day and never saw again afterward. She'd asked Garrett about them afterward, and he'd said they were work colleagues who'd moved away or old friends he'd lost touch with. Now she was wondering if those men had been from his other lives, if he'd pulled together people from different identities to fill out his wedding party. The thought made my skin crawl. Derek got up and went to our bookshelf where we kept photo albums. He pulled down our wedding album from 11 years ago and flipped to the photos of his side of the wedding party. Garrett had been the best man, standing right next to Derek in a gray suit with a white rose boutonniere. The other groomsmen had been Derek's college friends, people we'd stayed in touch with over the years. Garrett's +1 for the wedding had been a woman named Melissa, who he'd introduced as his girlfriend, but we'd never seen her again after that weekend. At the time, we'd assumed they'd broken up soon after. Now I wondered if Melissa had been Vanessa, brought from Austin for the weekend under a different name. Or maybe Jennifer from Seattle. Or someone else entirely from an identity we hadn't even discovered yet. How many lies had been told just to get through our wedding day? Patricia came over and looked at the wedding album with us. She pointed at Garrett's boutonniere and said she'd helped him put it on that morning, that he'd seemed nervous and she'd assumed it was normal best man jitters. She'd felt close to him that day. Felt like she was gaining a second son when Derek married me. All of that closeness had been manufactured. Robert joined us at the bookshelf and flipped through the album with hands that shook. He stopped at a photo of him and Garrett dancing with Robert's mother, the boy's grandmother who'd died 5 years ago. Robert said his mother had loved Garrett so much, had doted on him, had told Robert many times how lucky he was to have such a devoted son. She'd died thinking both her grandsons were good men who loved their family. Robert's voice broke and he closed the album carefully, like he was putting away a document of someone else's life. My doorbell rang and we all froze. Derek went to answer it and I heard him talking to someone in a low voice before he came back with 2 police officers. My stomach dropped thinking something terrible had happened, but one of the officers explained they were there because Jennifer Thompson in Seattle had called them. She'd reported her husband missing and potentially engaged in identity fraud and had given them our address as a last known location. The officer asked if Garrett Michael Townsend was present and Derek said no. He'd left hours ago. The officer asked when we'd last seen him and what kind of vehicle he was driving. Derek provided all the information he could, then showed them Vanessa's Instagram comment and explained the whole situation with the multiple identities. The officers exchanged glances, and the older one said this was beyond their jurisdiction as local police, that this sounded like a federal matter involving fraud across state lines. He said he'd file a report about Garrett being missing from our home, but the identity fraud issues would need to be reported to federal authorities. He took down all our contact information, and the information for Vanessa and Jennifer that we had. Before they left, the younger officer said something that made the situation feel even more surreal. He asked if we'd checked whether Garrett had any storage units rented locally, because people maintaining multiple identities often kept separate sets of belongings in different locations. That hadn't even occurred to any of us. Where did Garrett keep his Austin clothes when he was in Denver? Where were his Seattle belongings when he was in Phoenix? The logistics of maintaining 4 separate lives would require serious organization and storage. After the police left, Derek started searching online for storage facilities near our house. Robert said he remembered Garrett mentioning a storage unit years ago, claiming he was keeping some old furniture there from his apartment before he'd moved to Austin. Derek called several storage facilities in our area, asking if they had a unit rented under Garrett Michael Townsend, or any variation of that name. The third place he called confirmed they had a unit rented under that name. Derek asked if there was any way to access it, and the employee said only the person on the rental agreement could access it, but if Derek had a key, he could get in. Derek said he'd be there in 30 minutes and hung up before the employee could ask more questions. We all drove to the storage facility in 2 cars, leaving Sloan and Evan with my parents who'd agreed to come back and watch the kids. The facility was nearly empty on Christmas afternoon, just a lone employee in the office who barely looked up when we came in. Derek led us to Unit 217 on the 2nd floor of the climate-controlled building. He tried the lock with a key from Garrett's keyring that had been left on our kitchen counter, and it opened smoothly. Derek rolled up the door and we all stared at what looked like a completely furnished studio apartment inside the storage unit. A bed, a dresser, a small couch, a desk with a laptop, a mini fridge. Clothes hanging on a rack in 3 different sections, each labeled with a piece of tape. DEN, AUS, SEA. There was no PHX section, suggesting the Phoenix identity was new enough that he hadn't established local storage there yet. Patricia walked over to the dresser and opened the top drawer, pulling out a stack of driver's licenses and credit cards held together with a rubber band. Each ID showed Garrett's face but with different names, addresses, and dates of birth. She laid them out on the desk and we counted 11 different identities total, more than we'd found evidence for in the laptops. Garrett Thompson in Seattle, Michael Townsend in Austin, Garrett Michael in Denver, Thomas Garrett in Phoenix, plus 7 others in cities we hadn't even heard mentioned yet: Portland, Nashville, Atlanta, Minneapolis, Sacramento, Boise, Albuquerque. Each ID looked official, suggesting he'd either gotten very good at forgery or had access to someone who could make fake identification documents. Robert picked up a passport and flipped through it, showing stamps from countries all over the world. Business trips that had been real trips, just not to the places he'd told any of his families. Derek sat down on the small couch in the storage unit and put his head in his hands. I sat next to him, and we just existed in that space for a minute, surrounded by evidence of his brother's completely fabricated existence. My phone rang, and I saw it was Leslie calling again. I answered, and she said they'd made contact with Diana in Phoenix, who'd confirmed that Thomas Garrett had told her he was divorced with no kids and worked in pharmaceutical sales. Diana had been dating him for 18 months, and had recently started talking about moving in together. She was 27 years old, 12 years younger than Garrett's real age, and had no idea she was dating a man with at least 3 wives and multiple children scattered across the country. Leslie said Diana was devastated and furious, demanding to know how many other women there were. I looked around the storage unit at the organized sections of clothes and identification documents and said we'd found evidence of at least 11 different identities, maybe 11 different lives, though we didn't know yet if all of them involved families or if some were just identity shells he'd created for financial purposes. Leslie made a sound like she was choking and said Vanessa couldn't hear any more today, that she was done processing information and needed to focus on her daughters. Leslie said she'd keep us updated on what they found in Austin and asked us to do the same from Denver. We agreed, and I hung up feeling completely hollowed out. How did someone become this person? What happened in Garrett's past that made him decide to splinter his identity into so many pieces? Robert was going through the desk drawers and found a journal that he started reading out loud. The entries were dated and went back nearly 15 years. The early entries were from when Garrett was in college in Denver, describing the thrill of reinventing himself, of becoming someone new where nobody knew his history. He wrote about how liberating it felt to not be Michael anymore, to shed that identity and all the expectations that came with it. He described meeting Derek and thinking how easy it would be to construct a whole fake family history, how people would believe almost anything if you told them with enough confidence. The entries got progressively more disturbing as they went on, describing the Seattle identity as an experiment to see if he could maintain 2 separate lives simultaneously. He wrote about the challenge of it, the organizational requirements, the satisfaction of pulling it off. Later entries talked about Austin becoming complicated because Vanessa wanted more from him than he wanted to give, wanted him to be present in ways that interfered with his other lives. He wrote about considering leaving her, but then she got pregnant and he felt trapped. He described the birth of his first daughter in clinical terms, like he was observing someone else's life rather than participating in his own. There were entries about starting the Phoenix identity as a backup plan, a place to run if everything else collapsed. He wrote about how the various identities served different purposes. Denver was family and stability. Seattle was adventure and young kids who thought he was fun. Austin was his legal identity that he resented. Phoenix was freedom and possibility. Each identity let him be a different version of himself without any single version demanding too much. Patricia was crying again, harder this time, and Robert closed the journal like he couldn't read anymore. Derek stood up and said we should take everything to the police, all the identification documents and the journal and everything else in this unit. This was evidence of serious crimes and we needed to turn it over. Robert agreed and started gathering items, but I stopped them and said we should photograph everything first, document it all before we gave it to authorities. They might need copies for their own records, and once the police had the originals, we'd have no way to access them. Derek got his phone out and started taking pictures of every ID, every page of the journal, every section of the storage unit. The documentation took over an hour, and by the end we had hundreds of photos showing the scope of Garrett's deception. We loaded everything into boxes and drove to the police station. The officer at the front desk looked confused when Derek tried to explain what we were bringing in and had to call a supervisor. The supervisor, a lieutenant named Morrison, came out and listened to our explanation with increasingly wide eyes. He said this was definitely FBI territory and asked if we'd contacted them yet. Robert said we hadn't known who to contact, that this had all unfolded in the last few hours. Lieutenant Morrison said he'd file a report and forward everything to the FBI field office in Denver, but it being Christmas meant it would probably be the day after tomorrow before anyone followed up. He took all the physical evidence and gave us a receipt, then said we should expect calls from federal agents within the next few days. It was getting dark when we left the police station, Christmas evening settling in. We drove back to our house where my parents were waiting with Sloan and Evan, who ran to us asking if Uncle Garrett was coming back for dinner. Derek picked up Evan and held him tight, his face buried in his son's hair. He told the kids that Uncle Garrett had to leave unexpectedly and wouldn't be coming back. Evan started crying and asking why. What did he do wrong? Did Uncle Garrett not like him anymore? I felt my heart break watching my 6-year-old blame himself for an adult's failures. I knelt down and told him this had nothing to do with him, that sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems that kids don't need to worry about. Sloan looked at me with her 2 knowing eyes and asked if Uncle Garrett was a bad man. I didn't know how to answer that. My parents offered to stay and help with dinner, but we told them to go back to their hotel and rest. Patricia and Robert left too, both of them looking aged in a way that hadn't been visible that morning. Derek and I heated up leftovers and made the kids eat even though none of us had an appetite. After dinner, we tried to salvage some Christmas spirit by watching a movie together, but everyone's minds were elsewhere. I kept checking my phone for updates from Leslie or Jennifer or Vanessa, but there were no new messages. Garrett remained missing, his truck still not found, his phone still going to voicemail. He'd vanished completely, which probably meant he knew we'd discovered everything and was running. After we put the kids to bed, Derek and I sat in our living room looking at the Christmas tree that suddenly felt like a monument to false memories. Every ornament told a story, and many of those stories included Garrett. The handprint ornament Sloan had made for him when she was 4, the Seattle Seahawks decoration he'd given us, supposedly because he'd visited there once, but actually because he had a whole family there. The photo ornament from last Christmas showing all of us smiling, unaware that we were posing with someone who'd systematically lied to us for over a decade. Derek asked me how I was doing, and I realized I had no idea how to answer that question. How was I supposed to be doing after finding out my brother-in-law was essentially a con artist who'd defrauded multiple families? My phone rang close to midnight, and I saw it was Jennifer calling from Seattle. I answered, and she said she'd been contacted by FBI agents who'd gotten our police report forwarded to them despite the holiday. They'd asked her to come in for an interview tomorrow morning. She said the agents had told her this was a serious case involving potential wire fraud, identity theft, bigamy, and financial crimes that could add up to over 20 years in federal prison if Garrett was caught and convicted. Jennifer's voice was empty of emotion, like she'd cried herself out and had nothing left. She asked if I thought Garrett would ever come back to face the consequences, or if he'd just disappear forever into one of his fake identities. I said I honestly didn't know, that I'd never really known him at all. The next morning, the day after Christmas, I woke up to 17 missed calls and twice as many text messages. The story had broken. Someone, probably one of the women Garrett had deceived, had sold the story to a media outlet that had published it online overnight. The headline read, "Man maintained at least 4 separate families across U.S. for over a decade, FBI investigating." The article had quotes from Vanessa and Jennifer, details about the storage unit and the multiple identities, speculation about how many other victims there might be. Our Christmas photo was embedded in the article, the one that had started all of this, with Garrett's face circled in red. The story was spreading across social media, being shared thousands of times, generating hundreds of comments from people horrified and fascinated by the scope of the deception. Derek's phone started ringing with calls from reporters wanting comments, from old college friends asking if it was true, from distant relatives who'd seen the story online. We turned off our phones and tried to shield the kids from what was happening, but Sloan found the article on her tablet before we could stop her. She came downstairs crying, asking if Uncle Garrett had really lied to everyone. Derek sat her down and explained as gently as he could that yes, Uncle Garrett had made some very bad choices and had hurt a lot of people, including us. Sloan asked if she'd ever see him again, and Derek said he didn't know, that Uncle Garrett was missing right now and nobody knew where he'd gone. Evan heard this conversation and started crying too, saying he wanted Uncle Garrett to come back and say sorry. I held both kids while they processed the loss of someone important in their lives. The FBI called our house around 10 that morning. Special Agent Kimberly Ortega introduced herself and said she was leading the investigation into Garrett Michael Townsend, also known as Michael Garrett Townsend, also known as Garrett Thompson, also known as Thomas Garrett, plus several other aliases they were still confirming. She asked if we could come to their Denver office that afternoon for formal interviews. Derek said we'd be there and asked if they had any leads on Garrett's location. Agent Ortega said they'd issued a federal warrant for his arrest and had alerts at all airports and border crossings, but so far he hadn't been spotted. His truck had been found abandoned at a park-and-ride lot near the airport, suggesting he'd either flown somewhere or switched vehicles. They were reviewing security footage from the airport, but it would take time to go through it all. We drove to the FBI field office that afternoon, leaving Sloan and Evan with my parents again. The building was surprisingly busy for the day after Christmas, agents coming and going with purpose. Agent Ortega met us in the lobby and led us to a conference room where 2 other agents were waiting. They spent 3 hours asking us detailed questions about our relationship with Garrett, his visits to Denver, any financial transactions he'd had with us, anything suspicious we'd noticed over the years. Derek had to admit that he'd loaned Garrett $10,000 2 years ago for what Garrett had claimed was a business opportunity that fell through. The agents made notes and said that money was probably gone, likely used to fund one of his other identities. They asked about Garrett's childhood, and Robert and Patricia, who'd been interviewed separately, had provided family photos and documents going back to Garrett's birth. Agent Ortega showed us evidence they'd gathered from the other families. Bank statements showing Garrett had been systematically withdrawing small amounts from each family's joint accounts over the years, amounts small enough not to trigger immediate concern, but adding up to over $200,000 total. Tax returns filed under multiple names claiming different dependents and income sources. Property records showing he'd used various identities to secure rental leases, and even purchased the house in Austin. Credit card statements revealing a pattern of charges in different cities that matched up with his travel patterns. Insurance policies taken out under different names. The scope of the financial fraud was staggering. Agent Ortega said they were still piecing together the full extent, but it appeared Garrett had been stealing from his families to fund his various lives for over a decade. The other women had been contacted and interviewed. Vanessa and Jennifer we knew about. Diana in Phoenix had been devastated to learn the truth. But there were more. A woman named Claire in Portland who'd been engaged to someone named Michael Townsend for 6 months before he'd disappeared suddenly last year, taking her savings with him. A woman named Amanda in Nashville who'd dated Garrett Thompson for 2 years and had been ghosted when she'd started asking too many questions about his past. A woman named Sophia in Atlanta who'd had a brief relationship with Thomas Garrett and had noticed inconsistencies in his stories that had made her suspicious. Each woman had a similar story of a charming man who'd seemed perfect at first, who'd been attentive and romantic, who'd slowly revealed red flags that they'd explained away until the truth became undeniable. Agent Ortega said they believed Garrett had been using dating apps and social media to identify potential victims, women who were recently divorced or lonely or vulnerable in some way. He'd craft his persona to match what each woman seemed to need: successful businessman for Vanessa who wanted stability, fun adventurous dad for Jennifer who valued spontaneity, younger contemporary for Diana who wanted someone who made her feel young. He'd been strategic and deliberate in how he'd built each identity and relationship. The psychological manipulation was as disturbing as the financial fraud. These women hadn't just been deceived about his identity. They'd been specifically targeted and groomed to fit into the life he wanted them to play a role in. Derek asked if there was any chance Garrett could actually face consequences if he was never found. Agent Ortega said they'd frozen all his known bank accounts and assets, filed charges in multiple jurisdictions, and issued warrants that would follow him anywhere in the country. But yes, if he'd successfully fled the country using one of his fake identities, it would be much harder to bring him back. They were working with international law enforcement and monitoring known associates, but Garrett had proven himself skilled at disappearing and reinventing himself. The possibility that he might never face justice hung over us like a storm cloud. All these women he'd hurt, all these families he'd destroyed, and he might just vanish into another identity somewhere else and start over. We drove home in silence, both of us processing everything we'd learned. When we walked in the door, Patricia was there, having let herself in with the spare key. She was sitting at our kitchen table with a box of old photos spread out in front of her. She looked up when we entered and said she'd been going through family albums trying to understand if there had been any signs in Garrett's childhood that he would grow up to be this person. She showed us photos of two young boys, Derek and Garrett, playing together in a backyard, building sandcastles at a beach, dressed up for Halloween. In every photo, Garrett was smiling at the camera like he didn't have a care in the world. Patricia said she kept searching for something dark behind his eyes, some hint of the deception to come, but there was nothing. He'd just been a regular kid who'd grown into a monster. Robert arrived a few minutes later and said he'd been reviewing their financial records from over the years. He'd found several instances where Garrett had borrowed money from them for various emergencies that probably never existed. A car repair that totaled $3,000, a medical bill he couldn't cover worth $5,000, a security deposit for a new apartment for $2,000. Small amounts compared to what he'd stolen from the women he'd married, but it added up to $10,000 that Robert and Patricia would never see again. Robert said he felt like a fool for never questioning these requests, for trusting his son completely when Garrett had been systematically exploiting that trust. Patricia said the worst part was knowing those two little girls in Austin, Lily and Sophie, had grown up with a father who was fundamentally dishonest, who'd lied to them every single day of their lives. What kind of damage would that do to them when they eventually understood what their father had done? Over the next few days, the story continued to grow. More women came forward with stories of relationships with someone matching Garrett's description and various names. The FBI discovered at least 15 different identities he'd used over a 20-year period, some just briefly for specific cons, others maintained for years. They found evidence he'd been doing this since his early 20s, that the elaborate multifamily deception was the culmination of decades of practice at identity fraud. The media coverage was intense and invasive. Reporters showed up at our house wanting interviews. Camera crews filmed our street. Sloane couldn't go outside without someone trying to ask her questions about her uncle. We ended up sending both kids to stay with my parents in their hotel for several days just to give them some peace. Vanessa called me a week after Christmas and asked if we could talk, really talk, about what she was supposed to tell her daughters. Lily and Sophie knew their father had gone on a work trip and hadn't come back. They knew something was wrong, but not the full truth. Vanessa said her lawyer had advised her to tell them a version that was honest but age-appropriate, that their father had been lying about important things and had to go away for a while. But how did you explain to a 7-year-old and 5-year-old that their father had multiple other families? How did you help them process that their entire understanding of their family was based on lies? I had no good answers. I was struggling with the same questions about Sloane and Evan. We talked for over an hour, two mothers trying to figure out how to help our children heal from something we didn't understand ourselves. Jennifer organized a group video call with all the women Garrett had deceived. 10 of us total, ranging in age from Diana at 27 to Claire in Portland, who was 42. We sat in our separate homes looking at each other's faces on our screens, united by the shared experience of having been systematically manipulated by the same man. Some of the women were angry, demanding justice and compensation. Others were grief-stricken, mourning the loss of someone they'd loved who'd never really existed. Diana kept crying and apologizing for not seeing the signs, even though none of us had seen them either. Vanessa was the most composed, having had an extra week to process everything. She'd started therapy and encouraged all of us to do the same. She said we couldn't let Garrett's actions define the rest of our lives, that we had to find ways to move forward. The FBI called 2 weeks after Christmas with news that stopped my heart. They'd found Garrett. He'd been arrested in Toronto attempting to board a flight to London using a passport under yet another fake name they hadn't previously known about. Canadian authorities had detained him based on the international warrant, and he was being extradited back to the United States to face charges. Agent Ortega said the arrest had been complicated because Garrett had initially convinced Canadian immigration officials that the warrant was a mistake, that he was being wrongly accused by a crazy ex-wife. He'd been so convincing that they'd almost let him go. Only a last-minute verification with FBI headquarters had confirmed his identity and prevented his escape. Even caught red-handed, he'd tried to lie his way out. The extradition process took 3 weeks. During that time, media coverage intensified even more. Garrett's arrest photo went viral, his face plastered across news sites and social media with headlines about the man who'd had 4 families. Psychological experts weighed in on television trying to explain how someone could maintain such elaborate deceptions. Dating app companies issued warnings about verifying identity. Think pieces were written about the dangers of trusting too easily. Garrett became a symbol, a cautionary tale, the subject of true crime podcast episodes and YouTube video analysis. His victims, all of us, became public figures against our will, our pain and humiliation documented for entertainment. When Garrett finally arrived back in Denver for his initial court appearance, Derek and I went to the courthouse along with Robert and Patricia. We sat in the gallery watching as guards brought Garrett in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He'd lost weight in the weeks since Christmas, his face gaunt and unshaven. He scanned the courtroom and his eyes landed on us. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Not remorse exactly, but recognition that this was really happening, that his carefully constructed worlds had all collapsed. The judge read the charges, which took several minutes. 15 counts of identity fraud, 8 counts of wire fraud, multiple bigamy charges, tax evasion, theft. The list went on and on. Garrett's lawyer entered a not guilty plea and asked for bail to be set. The prosecutor argued he was an extreme flight risk given his history and multiple false identities. The judge agreed and ordered him held without bail pending trial. After the hearing, Agent Ortega told us the trial would probably be 6 months away, that the government needed time to build their case given the complexity and scope of the crimes. She said they were confident of conviction on most charges, and Garrett was looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison if found guilty on everything. That timeline stretched out in front of us like a road with no end. 6 months of waiting, then a trial that could last weeks, then appeals that could drag on for years. Meanwhile, all of us had to figure out how to rebuild our lives around this absence. This void where someone we'd loved and trusted had been revealed to be nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Vanessa filed for divorce immediately, and the court granted her emergency custody of Lily and Sophie. Jennifer did the same in Seattle with her 2 boys. Diana, who'd never been married to Garrett, filed civil suits for fraud and emotional distress. Several other women did the same. The financial wreckage was massive. Bank accounts that had been emptied. Credit scores destroyed by loans taken out in the women's names without their knowledge. Property that had been purchased using fraudulent information that now had to be untangled legally. IRS investigations into tax fraud that affected everyone who'd filed joint returns with Garrett under any of his identities. It would take years to sort out, and most of the women would probably never recover the money he'd stolen. 3 months after Christmas, Derek and I sat down with Sloan and Evan to have a real conversation about Uncle Garrett. We showed them age-appropriate news articles and explained as honestly as we could that Uncle Garrett had been living several different lives with different families, that he'd lied to everyone including us, and that he'd been arrested because what he did was against the law. Sloan asked why he would do that, and I said that was a question even the adults couldn't answer, that sometimes people make choices that don't make sense to anyone else. Evan asked if Uncle Garrett still loved them, and Derek said he didn't know, that Uncle Garrett's actions didn't show love the way we understood it. Both kids cried and asked questions we couldn't answer. It was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. The trial, when it finally happened 8 months later, lasted 3 weeks. Derek and I attended every day, sitting in the gallery watching evidence presented and witnesses called. Vanessa testified first, describing the lies Garrett had told her about his family being dead, about his work trips that were actually visits to other families, about the financial manipulation and emotional abuse. Jennifer testified about finding out her husband had another wife and kids in Austin. Diana testified about being deceived by a man who'd specifically targeted her because she'd just gotten out of a bad relationship and was vulnerable. Each woman's testimony was devastating, painting a picture of systematic predatory behavior spanning decades. Garrett's defense tried to argue that he had mental health issues that compelled his behavior, that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions. The prosecution brought in psychiatric experts who confirmed Garrett had antisocial personality disorder, but said that didn't absolve him of legal responsibility. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on 42 of the 48 charges. The judge scheduled sentencing for a month later. When that day came, the courtroom was packed with victims and their families, all wanting to see justice served. The judge allowed victim impact statements, and 10 women stood up one by one to describe how Garrett's actions had destroyed their lives, their finances, their ability to trust. Vanessa spoke about her daughters asking when Daddy was coming home, about trying to explain to young children why their father was a criminal. Jennifer talked about her sons having nightmares, about the therapy bills she couldn't afford. When it was Derek's turn, he talked about losing not just a brother, but his entire understanding of his family history, about explaining to his elderly parents that their son had been lying to them for 30 years. The judge sentenced Garrett to 28 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before serving 23 years. He'd be 62 years old before he could even be considered for release. As guards led him out of the courtroom, Garrett looked back one more time. His eyes found Patricia in the crowd and she looked away. That moment felt like the final severing of the connection between Garrett and the Denver family he'd fabricated. He'd destroyed every relationship he'd claimed to value, burned every bridge, left only wreckage behind. Whatever had driven him to construct such elaborate lies, it had cost him everything, including decades of his life locked in a prison cell. 2 years after that Christmas morning when everything came apart, Derek and I sat in our living room putting up our tree while Sloan and Evan decorated it with new ornaments we'd bought together. We'd thrown away all the old decorations that reminded us of Garrett, started fresh with new traditions that belonged just to us. The kids were doing better, their therapy sessions less frequent now, their questions about Uncle Garrett less anguished. Vanessa had remarried to a man who treated her daughters like his own. Jennifer was rebuilding her life in Seattle with help from her family. The other women had scattered to their own healing journeys. We'd formed a support group that met online monthly, all of us connected by this strange shared trauma, helping each other navigate the aftermath. The story still popped up occasionally in true crime media, but it no longer dominated our lives. Garrett was just a cautionary tale now, a warning about trusting too easily, a reminder that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we don't know at all.